Hello and welcome back to Level Up Rugby. Now, in the previous two videos we have been building up to answer the question of which style of kicking tee is best, and today we are answering that question. Now, in part one we defined what a sweet strike is, how it is achieved and why it is important to achieve it, which then helped us decipher where on the ball surface the sweetest strike is made in part two. If you don't know the answer to all of those questions, please go and check out part one and part two before you continue watching this part, because it will really help you solidify your understanding. So, to achieve the most efficient and effective strike on the ball, you must strike the ball in a straight line along the horizontal axis, because this is where the largest possible indent is made and therefore the sweetest strike, as we covered in the previous two parts. But today, in the rounding off of this step of the process, we are not only considering which style of tee provides the sweet spot with the largest potential ball indent, but we are also including the very important factor of how consistently you can reach that maximum potential strike. Any skill is acquirable. Some are easy and some are more difficult, but one way or another, they can all be achieved. However, the difference when it comes to goal kicking in rugby is that it's not just achieving that skill once that is important, but more so how consistently you can achieve that very best result. And that is the key of today's video. Although in the last video we concluded that the horizontal axis provides the greatest potential for a sweet strike, today we're going to add the important factor of how achievable that full potential is, and therefore decide which axis and method of strike of which style of kicking tee provides the overall most consistent sweet strike. If you were to have the ball sat upright on an upright kicking tee and were to strike it in the most efficient and effective way, a straight line along the horizontal axis where the largest indent is made, the ball would simply travel forwards with no height. The same goes when you pass a ball in football. If you want to pass the ball along the ground in the most efficient and effective way, you strike along that horizontal axis and the ball will move forwards. But if you want to send the ball the furthest, like a goal kick, to gain the maximum loft and drive, you strike the ball in the same straight line along the horizontal axis, but this time the horizontal axis is pointing up at 45 degrees. A quick side note, why 45 degrees? Well, it's the same as throwing a javelin. To throw a javelin the furthest, you must release it at 45 degrees, because this is the angle where the maximum amount of height and distance is achieved. If you were to increase the angle of release, the javelin would travel with a much higher arc, not really going as far, and if you were to reduce the angle of release, it would travel a lot closer to the ground and therefore again not travel as far. So therefore, this is why 45 degrees is the perfect balance to release the javelin, because you're not sacrificing height for length or length for height. It's the perfect middle ground. Now then, when you bring it back to the upright ball sat on the upright tee, you can't just simply strike the ball up at 45 degrees, because as we said in part two, by our definition, this is no longer a sweet strike, because you're making contact at the bottom of the ball and coming up. But there is a way of overcoming this that isn't rather orthodox in rugby union, but is very common in rugby league. Instead of just accepting this not optimal strike, where you're not maximising the full potential of the ball in your strike because you're coming from the bottom up rather than through the horizontal axis, rugby league kickers, for their kickoffs, start to tilt the ball back. Now, as you can see, when you do this, the horizontal axis to strike along is now pointing up at that optimal 45 degrees. Meaning that now when you strike the ball in the most efficient and effective way along the horizontal axis to achieve the sweetest possible strike, the ball can actually take off and fly in the most optimal way with height and length, as opposed to straight along the ground when you strike through the horizontal axis. However, this creates one very big issue. As you can imagine, when stood at the back of my approach, the sweet spot that I'm aiming for is now almost impossible to see. And this issue only gets worse the closer that you get to the ball, to the point of contact where when you're looking down at the ball, you completely lose sight of the spot that you're aiming for. This may be okay for rugby league kickoffs where the main objective is to simply get the ball as far downfield as possible. So potentially sacrificing a degree of accuracy for extra distance isn't as big of an issue. You would much rather increase the possibility for making the sweetest strike on the ball and gain further distance downfield by tilting the ball back, but live with the increased probability of not consistently making contact in the exact most optimal spot. Because this is a very difficult skill to strike the sweet spot that you cannot see. This may be okay for rugby league kickoffs where simply getting the ball downfield is much more valuable than the direction that ball travels in. You don't mind sacrificing a degree of accuracy and consistency for just added distance. But the difference is, in your goal kicking, you can't afford to sacrifice that accuracy or consistency for distance. Accuracy and consistency are equally, if not more important than distance. To some extent, it doesn't particularly matter if you can kick the ball 100 meters or 30 meters, if it doesn't ever go between the posts. So yes, tilting the ball back so that the horizontal axis is pointing up at that optimal 45 degrees is the method with the greatest potential sweet strike. But that maximum potential is a very hard skill to achieve once, let alone with consistency and accuracy, because of your inability to see the spot in the ball that you're aiming to strike. It's like trying to hit a bullseye on the dartboard blindfolded. We're not talking about winning the world record for the furthest distance a rugby ball has ever been kicked off a kicking tee. Yes, we want to increase the distance of our goal kicking, and how you strike the ball, as we said in part one, is a very important factor of how far the ball will travel. But not to the point where we're sacrificing accuracy and consistency. Because unlike rugby league kickoffs, place kicking has an equal level of importance on distance, accuracy and consistency. We are looking to crown the overall best style of kicking tee, so we must consider all factors. Not just which style provides the potential for the sweetest strike, but which tee makes achieving the full potential of the sweet strike easier and more likely, so it can be repeated with consistency and accuracy. Although the 45-degree tilted horizontal axis may have the greatest potential strike possible on the ball, the probability of you consistently striking the sweet spot in that exact precise place to achieve the full potential that axis is offering is incredibly low, because you're somewhat guessing where you are striking. Therefore, this decreases the overall score of this method of strike. It may have the greatest potential, but achieving that potential is very, very difficult. Yes, all skills can be acquired if you work hard with consistency and practice, but to achieve this skill consistently, especially under pressure, is very, very difficult. On the other hand, when you tilt the vertical axis back, it starts to look somewhat more familiar. Again, like the pass in football and the upright ball on the upright tee, if you were to strike the ball in the most efficient and effective way through the vertical axis to achieve the second sweetest strike on the ball, as we determined in part two, the ball again would only travel forwards with no height. But this time, when you tilt the vertical axis back to point up at that optimal 45-degree angle, we start to see a familiar sight. Now, at the back of my approach and at the point of contact, I can see the sweet spot that I'm aiming to strike. This makes striking that precise and exact sweet spot a lot easier and therefore more achievable, meaning that it's an easier skill to acquire with consistency. As the key to this video states, any skill is achievable with time, practice and hard work, but some are harder than others, making them more difficult to achieve consistency with, especially under pressure. In this case, the hardest skill to achieve is striking the horizontal axis when the ball is tilted back, because you're not able to see the point you are aiming to strike. Yes, you can achieve it 1 out of 100 times, but those other 99 times, you'll most likely be very far off achieving the ball's full potential. On the other hand, the easier skill of hitting the point of the ball means that although the maximum potential will never be as great as the horizontal axis, your average strike will consistently be a lot better when you strike through the vertical axis. So to rank our three options, considering the factors of potential for the sweetest strike and consistency of achieving that full potential, in last place we have the upright ball on the upright tee. Although you're able to see the sweet spot throughout your approach, to strike the ball at that optimal 45 degrees, you have to make contact down at the bottom of the ball, which by our definition is not a sweet strike. So this drops its overall score to being in dead last place. In second place is the tilted back ball on the upright tee. Although this method of strike has the greatest ball maximization potential, consistently achieving that full potential is an incredibly difficult skill due to the fact that you cannot see the point that you're striking on the ball. This heavily reduces its overall score because although it has the greatest potential, your average score is a lot lower when it comes to actually achieved ball indent. That means that first place goes to the 45-degree tilted vertical axis on the telescopic kicking tee. The vertical axis is a close second place to the horizontal axis with regard to sweet strike potential, as we found in part 2. But then this potential is a lot easier to achieve because you can actually see the spot on the ball that you're aiming to strike. This gives this method of strike the highest overall score on average, meaning that each strike that you have on the ball is going to be a lot closer to its full potential. Although its full potential is a lot lower, you're much more likely to get as close to it as possible. Whereas the higher potential of the horizontal axis is a lot harder to even get close to. But the benefits of consistency and accuracy don't stop there with the vertical axis. Another benefit to the vertical axis in regard to accuracy is that there is only one point of entry and one point of exit, each end of the ball. This means that, again, to strike the ball in the most efficient and effective way, a straight line, and achieve the sweetest strike, there is only one line through the ball that you can do that, end to end. This means that the ball acts as a sort of scope to aim down. And as I'll be covering in more detail in a later video on ball alignment, this has a real added benefit when it comes to improving accuracy. On the other hand, the horizontal axis has so many different entry and exit points, an almost infinite number all the way around the circumference of the ball. This gives you no real scope to aim down, which means that you really have to know where you are kicking the ball. The scope of the vertical axis means that if you point the ball down the middle of the posts, the ball now becomes your target, because if you kick in a straight line along that vertical axis, as you should look to do to achieve the sweetest possible strike, the ball will now fly straight. So not only can you see the sweet spot that you're aiming for, but if you truly commit to striking in the most efficient and effective way, a straight line along the vertical axis to achieve that sweetest possible strike, the ball will fly straight. So the telescopic tee acts as a sort of scope which really aids accuracy and consistency. But like I said, make sure you check out the next video on ball alignment when we reach that stage of the process. I know in part 2, one of the strengths of why the horizontal axis had a larger indent potential is because of the increased surface area of the panel of the ball to absorb the foot. But when weighing up overall performance, again, although the horizontal axis has the greatest potential sweet strike, it is very difficult to achieve that full potential once, let alone consistently and with accuracy. This larger surface area of the panel of the ball means that of the total sum of the surface area of the ball, the specific sweet spot that you're aiming to strike takes up a much smaller proportion of the whole surface area. On the other hand, the surface area around the vertical axis, the point of the ball, is a lot smaller. This means of that smaller surface area, the sweet spot that you're aiming for now takes up a bigger proportion of it, making it a lot easier to hit and therefore achieve that maximum potential of your strike. Take a dartboard, for example. The horizontal axis is the entire dartboard, and the bullseye is the sweet spot that you're aiming for. Now, of that full dartboard, the bullseye only takes up 1/100th of its total surface area. But now let's say we take away the outer rim, leaving only everything inside that 3 times scoring ring. Now, as a proportion of the new surface area of the smaller dartboard, the bullseye, still being the same size, takes up a greater proportion of that smaller surface area. I'd say about 1/60th of it, meaning that it's a lot easier to hit. Now, yes, you could argue that of all the possibilities of what you could hit with the dart, for example, the board, the wall, the floor, the ceiling, etc., the bullseye still takes up the same surface area. So no matter the size of the dartboard, you still have the same chance of hitting everything else but the dartboard. But then I ask you this, taking it back to goal kicking, have you ever seen anyone completely miss the ball? Taking it back to the ball, of course, the sweet spot on the vertical axis takes up a much larger proportion of the total surface area that you could strike, especially in comparison to the horizontal axis, meaning that there are so many places other than that sweet spot that you can strike, making the possibility of you mishitting and going wrong on the horizontal axis so much greater. You can strike in so many places other than that sweet spot. You can strike down at the bottom of the ball, you can strike too high, you can strike too wide, too narrow, whereas on the vertical axis, that space that you can strike too high is very small, and the space that you can strike too low is very small, and too narrow and too wide. The space to get things right is a lot greater on the total surface area. Whereas on the horizontal axis, you have the full panel that you can miss-hit. You can hit too low, too wide, too narrow. You can get it right, yes, but the chances of that, in terms of mathematical probability, the chances of you hitting that sweet spot are much lower than on the vertical axis. If the horizontal sweet spot wasn't already hard enough to hit for that reason, let's not forget the first point, that when tilted back on the 45 degrees, that the ball must be to reach its full potential, you also cannot see the sweet spot. So not only is it an infinitely small spot on an infinitely large space, you also can't see it. On the other hand, the vertical axis is much easier to hit because, like we said, it takes up a greater proportion of the total space that you could miss-hit, meaning that it's a lot harder to hit too low, too narrow, too wide, too high. It's a lot easier to hit that point of the ball, meaning that the full potential is a lot easier to reach, like we've been saying this whole time. These two factors of your blindfolded approach and the size of the sweet spot on the total surface area of the ball combine to make the skill of reaching the maximum potential of the horizontal axis so much harder. Not only is it a tiny spot on the ball, but you also can't see that tiny spot, making this method of strike off the upright kicking tee a very difficult skill, especially to gain accuracy and consistency with. So to conclude these 3 parts, the horizontal axis provides the greatest potential for the sweetest strike on the ball. Therefore, the upright kicking tee, as long as you're tilting the ball back at that 45-degree angle so the ball actually gains height, is the best method for achieving the greatest potential sweet strike. However, actually achieving that sweet strike is an incredibly difficult skill. One, because you cannot see the spot that you're aiming for on approach when the ball is tilted back, and 2, the spot that you are aiming for is incredibly small on an incredibly large surface area. For those 2 reasons, they compound one another to mean that you actually have to guess where you're striking the ball. This means that to consistently strike in the most optimal place is incredibly difficult. Yes, you can become good at it if you practice and work hard, but to achieve it consistently, especially under pressure, is an incredibly difficult skill. And to combine the fact that you have to have accuracy when you're striking this ball as well. It doesn't matter just how far you send it, but the direction that you're sending it is equally as important. So therefore it makes the skill of achieving the sweetest possible strike on the horizontal axis when it's tilted upright at 45 degrees on an upright kicking tee very difficult. On the other hand, the vertical axis is the second sweetest sweet spot on the ball. Yes, it's not as great, it doesn't have as high of a potential for ball indent as the horizontal axis, but achieving the full potential of the vertical axis is a lot higher. Because one, you can see the spot that you're aiming for, and two, that spot is a lot easier to hit because it takes up a larger proportion of the total possible surface area that you could hit. Not only this, but accuracy is a lot easier to achieve, again, as I'll be covering in a later video in more detail, because there is only one line that you can strike through the ball from end to end. That's the only line that you can take. On the other hand, through the horizontal axis, there's an almost infinite amount of lines all the way through the ball. This makes the telescopic kicking tee the winner of the best style of kicking tee. Yes, its potential is a little less than the upright kicking tee for the sweetest possible strike, but on average, you will strike the ball consistently so much better off a telescopic kicking tee, especially with accuracy. So therefore, we crown the telescopic kicking tee the winner of the best style of kicking tee. Yes, its potential is not as high as the upright kicking tee, but on average, you will strike the ball consistently and with accuracy so much better off a telescopic kicking tee for the reasons mentioned in this video. So in my opinion, with these facts that I've brought up, the telescopic kicking tee is the best kicking tee to use.